Hey everyone, I am sorry for giving you a late lecture this week. This week has been hectic as usual. Um, I and especially because these are my two favorite topics. Um, talking about gender, sexuality, and talking about race, ethnicity, and they also are the most difficult, really, to talk about in just a chapter because it's so much, so many layers. But I will try to, just kind of bring it home to kind of current day conversation, just like I normally do with the lectures. So the the chapter, so I'm not going to go into all of the definitions that the PowerPoint does. You can read those on your own. Um, but I would like to kind of just dive into some of the topics um, that are discussed in here. Uh, I think it's this idea of social constructs is can be kind of difficult for people to grasp. This idea that some of these concepts, it is kind of a mixture of obviously, people are biologically born a certain gender, um, but their gender expression, how they present as masculine or feminine, is culturally defined. And then also sexuality is also culturally defined, and it has changed over time throughout the centuries. One thing that really kind of made me think more deeply about this was a book I read. Oh goodness, it was about marriage and about the social construction of marriage, and it was this. And they talked about how in the 1800s, Kuntz was the author's last name. Um, and so it talked about how in the 1800s, marriage was originally a contract between people, a financial contract. And I think many of you are familiar with, you see on TV with royals, wealthy people, they kind of just arrange marriages. There's even a TV show on Netflix about Indian arranged marriages. And so, um, you know, originally marriage was a contract as a way to bring families together and as a way really to survive and combine assets and to produce children. But this concept of love really didn't emerge in the way that we see it until the late 1800s. Um, and it became commercialized. So, um, this idea that we marry for love or that we have passion for your partner um, is a new thing, right? And so it's socially constructed, but then also these roles, these ideas of the roles of men and women, some of it is based in kind of biology, right? That men are physically stronger than women. But men don't become physically stronger, or boys don't. Boys are often the weaker gender when they're born. They're less likely to survive. They're smaller, and they you know don't are just they're smaller and don't weigh as much, right, as girls until puberty hits, right? So hormones kind of kick in, and then the roles change, right? Because I remember when I was a kid, I was a girl, I was taller than the boys, I was faster than them, I was stronger than them, and then something changed, right? The hormones changed, and then all of a sudden I wasn't as fast, I wasn't as strong, and the boys were, they just picked it up, right? And so there are some biological concept or biological um, definitely reasons why we have differences, sex differences. However, there are also social constructions of those sex differences and social constructions of sexuality. So, for example, I don't know if you all have heard of, or I started talking, I was looking for that book. I think her name was Stephanie Coons. Yes, The Evolution of American Families. So, or The Real Story of American Families. That was a book that I read, and I thought it was a really good book. So you can check that one out if you want. Um, so where was I going? I started thinking about that, and now I can't remember what I was talking about. um, but oh, so there's ancient Greek and Roman times. The idea of love oftentimes was between two men, and it was very accepted that you would have a male partner. And it was not seen as lacking in masculinity. If anything, if you didn't have a male partner, it was considered not masculine because of status. And that real love, true love, could only happen between two men because in order for, and it was kind of sexist in a way because their love evolved through intellect, intellectual exchange. And so there was no concept of homosexuality or heterosexuality. It was just agape love versus eros love versus, ethos love. And so, these kind of these constructions of heterosexual and homosexual and bisexual and asexual kind of emerged over time as our society kind of pushes the boundaries, and or retracts in our kind of thinking and becomes more conservative. We create categories to try to fit people into certain categories to help us understand differences between people. So this idea of homosexual, even in the 1800s, women, like if you look at a lot of the Victorian books, they talk about bosom buddies, right? Women were bosom buddies. That meant that was your girlfriend. That meant that they were in a relationship with each other. They loved each other. They may have even had sexual relationship with each other, and then they would marry a heterosexual partner. So it was all about this kind of closeness between two people, um, and purposefully segregating these genders, right? Um, because of society's understanding of needing to separate genders. Men should be with men, women should be with women, and the only reason they join together is to procreate. So this idea of love did not emerge until the late 1800s, early 1900s, to where people were actually marrying for love rather than for functionality. And then I think that also kind of created some more really socially constructed boundaries around what was acceptable love and what was not acceptable love. What was acceptable relationship? You could have you could have a same sex relation, and I also don't like this use of homosexual is weird for me right now because it's not really politically correct anymore. You could have a same sex relationship, um, but as long as you kept it behind closed doors and it wasn't like an official relationship, then it was accepted, right? And so then as kind of as we evolve, it became less and less accepted, less and less tolerated. And then we had a revolution, kind of a cultural revolution in the 60s, um, both in regards to gender and sexual expression, as well as a racial kind of um, revolution for civil rights. And so the 60s kind of redefined how we expressed and understood sexuality. It's also culturally different, right? Because um, I think I mentioned this before, but some American Indian communities have what they call a three spirit person. And so that person is what you would call a transgender person today, or an intersex person who has both male and female, right? Male and female identity, or sexual organs, both male and female sexual organs. And they didn't see them as this outcast or this odd thing. They revered them, right? As as gods. And so, you know, these kind of cultural understandings of what is normal, what's not normal, that kind of helps you think about how things are socially constructed, right? Um, I've also seen some scholars even kind of go deeper than that and saying that there's racial kind of understanding, or you can add the another layer of racial understanding to that. So you have that cultural ethnic layer to it, but you also have these kind of racial layers in the sense that um, you know, our understanding of masculine and feminine are complicated by stereotypes that are tied to what a black man and a black woman, a Latinx woman and a Latinx man would be, an Asian man and an Asian woman would be in the context of the United States, as opposed to the norm of what one man woman neutral, but based on European standards would be. So, for example, actually, I'm gonna just do a demonstration. I like to do this a couple times. You know, do like a Google search. Okay, so if you search for Asian man, there are stereotypes about what an Asian man is and whether they fit within the standard of um, traditional European, white European standards of masculinity. So there's a couple here. There's a couple of images here that I think are interesting. One is that they say that in the United States, Asian men are the least desirable on social apps, on dating apps. Um, Probably because of some of the stereotypes and these expectations about masculinity. Asian men are portrayed as um, educated, smart, nerdy, um, quiet, submissive, um, and small, like short people, you know, small people. That is obviously not always true for many reasons, but those are the stereotypes. And if you, I don't know if you all have seen Breakfast at Tiffany's, but this character to me is just, it has always bothered me to see it. Let's see if it has a little video clip. So you can see he's clumsy, he can't see. He's small. He's not attractive. He doesn't speak English well. Right, all of these things.
What happened to you anyway? You take off for the powder room, and that's the last I see you.
Not really, Harry.
Harry was the other.
And so then that has consequences for how people see them, right? So a lot of times that has consequences for Asian men being not seen as good leaders, not getting advancement in their work, even though they may be even be paid higher. They may even have higher wages. They actually earn more than the traditional white family, and have more wealth than the traditional white family, and even have better health outcomes than traditional white families. But they oftentimes reach glass ceilings because of these stereotypes about what an Asian man is and how they can fulfill these kind of roles, masculine roles. So that's just an example of that. And so instead of us thinking about them in these sexual orientations and these genders in binary terms, we've started to evolve to think about them as a spectrum of sexuality, from kind of exclusively heterosexual to kind of heterosexual to most of the time heterosexual to bisexual, right? And so, and then we've also kind of added in a couple more terms Pansexual is one where, bisexual is really this idea that you are attracted to a man and a woman, right? So it's based on these ideas of traditional understandings of gender, right? You're attracted to a man, you're attracted to a woman. But pansexual could mean that they are also attracted to transgender people or intersex people, right? And so there is kind of a spectrum, and we're continuing to add terminologies. One, as we better understand ourselves and are a little bit more open to those things, but also as people are defining for themselves how they identify. So that kind of identity and gender expression, like I was explaining, certain kind of expressions of masculine and feminine um, do kind of play into our looking glass self and how we identify our genders. I want to give you another example of from my dissertation. Some of the work that I did was interviewing Black gay men about their experiences. Um, Black gay men about their experiences with kind of identity conflict between being Black and gay. And so I want to go back to this idea that there are kind of overlapping identities and how they intersect and affect people's lives. Um, a lot of times, the men who I interviewed, what I thought was interesting was that there's stigma against them both being Black and gay. However, the way that they were able to fight that stigma was by reinforcing norms of them as masculine. So they would walk a certain way and they would talk a certain way um, as a way to combat other stigma associated with them being gay, right? So they would kind of put on a masculine persona almost as a way to hide being gay. Um, but they couldn't hide being Black, right? Because it's a skin color. It's something that you're has been ascribed to you. It's assigned to you, and so they then had to find other ways to mitigate that stigma by being in Black communities, right? That are affirming of their Black identity and that kind of thing. And so they would go to predominantly Black churches, even though they were also gay, and could choose to go to a predominantly gay affirming, maybe predominantly white church, but they oftentimes did not choose to go to those churches because they did not feel comfortable or they felt discriminated against and stigmatized for being Black in those white spaces, even though they were both gay, right? So those kind of layers, I think, are interesting to think about and tease apart. Um, okay, so like I said, there's kind of there has been some intolerance of LGBT populations, definitely more likely to be raped and to skip school because it's unsafe. 41% of transgender people have attempted suicide. Um, and the murder rate of transgender uh, people is very high in the United States. But I also want to make the case, not the case, but make the point that the though of those people who are murdered, those transgender people who are murdered, it's often male to female transgender people, and they're often Black. So there's kind of um, these additional layers of inequality that transpire, I guess, or translate into real life consequences for people, right? That there's racism, both racism, heterosexism, homophobia slash heterosexism, and then this kind of gendered discrimination, because people, if they're not conforming to what our traditional understanding of masculinity is, if they're not conforming to our traditional understanding of gender norms and gender binary, as well as sexuality, and then on top of that, you are a person from a group that was enslaved in the United States and seen as the most dangerous, most reviled group in the United States. Well, that it makes sense that all of those layers of inequality would transpire in suicide and murder rates. Um, and so part of our role as sociologists is to try to understand those, how the data, like how a rate, like a suicide rate, why is that rate happening? How is it happening? How do we use our understanding of theory to explain how those rates are happening? Okay. This one is interesting. As rank increases, the number of female faculty decreases, um, which I think is interesting because during the pandemic, um, let's see, I had an article I was going to show you. During the pandemic, more and more articles are coming out about the fact that women who are, especially professional women who are at home and working, have experienced even more burden than men. And so, oh my goodness. Okay, we're done. We're good. And so the virus has moved female faculty to the brink, which is one of the headlines right now in the New York Times. Think about faculty. We have to write articles, we have to do research, we have to teach classes, we have to grade. I'm also writing grants and running a whole program and trying to raise awareness about COVID-19 vaccines at the same time for the whole state, right? And I love that work. I'm not complaining about that work, but oh my God, if I had children, the faculty members that I have meetings with, they have their kids screaming in the background. They can't, obviously, a lot of times they're not even able to get work done in the morning because they have to also manage their children's schedule. And many of them are also married, right? And so their spouses are not doing the amount of work that they are, and they're not getting as much help either. And then on top of that, being a faculty of color, there's this like expectation that we are supposed to be addressing diversity issues and serving on diversity councils and solving the diversity problem, right? So it's just a lot of pressure and dealing with, what they call the female tax. Oh, that also reminds me of another. Well, so I was gonna let me keep that open because I was gonna mention that later. Um, the female tax is also interesting because um, they recently made it. This article is old, but there's quite a bit of movement to remove high taxes on. Here we go. High taxes on feminine hygiene products. Like, why is it that this is a necessity, right, for women? Half of the population, um, for their monthly hygiene, right? This is something that every woman goes through, and yet we have to pay a tax on this necessity, right? So then you're paying more money for something that you need, and it's financially burdensome for people. And then when you look at women pay high tax rates for feminine hygiene products, and you can see the high tax rates for these like wealthy countries, and then yet in these other countries it's tax free. They just passed law, I think they just passed a law that allows women to use their health insurance to pay for these items. But if you imagine, you start menstruation at 15 years, or well, no, you started younger than that. You start menstruation at like 10, 11 years old, maybe 12, all the way to 45. That's a long time to be paying every month, right? That's thousands of dollars that only women have to pay, right? So there are some kind of considerations about the burden that is placed on women that men don't have to deal with financially, professionally, time wise, energy wise, right? Um, and so there is some stratification and inequality that can manifest itself also based on these expectations of what women should be, right? Women are supposed to be nurturing, they're supposed to take care of their children. And now we're also supposed to be professional. um, and yet, men are the ones who benefit and get paid more money for taking care of the household because of this idea that men are supposed to be breadwinners. Obviously y'all are familiar with the idea of also sexual harassment and women um, experiencing sexual harassment. I think also this also ties to the idea that women are weak and vulnerable, and so they can be preyed upon through sexual harassment and sexual advances. Um, the reason why I say that is because um, men who don't always conform to masculine norms also experience sexual harassment and also experience rape and also experience, and so it's not just about men versus women, it's about power dynamics and the idea that someone is vulnerable and weak and then they can be taken advantage of through these types of behaviors. Okay, I'm skipping through some of this stuff. I think another, they're talking about, also kind of the inequality of women versus men, um, that women are oftentimes hypersexualized. I think men are also hypersexualized, but in different ways. Hypersexualized to be dominant and to be, um, yeah, to be dominant, whereas women are hypersexualized to be subservient and be submissive and to be the sexual playthings of men. And so there are some scripts that I think a lot of women have to reprogram themselves um, in regards to, because part of that is also the way that we're socialized as children. Like you're taught to wear pink, you're taught to use your dolls as babies, right? And to take care of things. You are taught to um, be seen and not heard. You're taught that your value is in your beauty, right? And so those things kind of translate into also submissive behavior, as well as this idea that you are here for the sexual pleasure of the man. Um, but that's not always true, and so I think that's the thing that's important is that none of these things are fast and hard rules. Obviously there are plenty of couples that are egalitarian, plenty of women who don't conform to those, and plenty of men who don't conform to those. And I think that there is a cultural shift away from those things, from that hypersexualization of women, into a more sexual empowerment kind of phase. Um, there are some also kind of issues around the control of bodies, right, and control of women's bodies. This is kind of on the table right now in the Supreme Court, the idea that do women have the right to abortion or not, um, and does the U.S. government have should the U.S. government have the right to dictate what a woman does with their body and their pregnancy? Of course, the abortion rate has dropped to the lowest rate since 1973. Um, and, there are some kind of religious and philosophical questions about um, the right to life, which are important to consider. But also, if you make abortions illegal, then being denied an abortion increase the risk of mental health problems, but also abortions don't stop just because they're illegal. They just go underground and they become less safe. And so we have to also think about kind of ways to, just like when you tell a teenager don't have sex, that doesn't always mean that a teenager will not have sex. It just means that they were told not to have sex, right? And so we have to think about what, how do we make sure that people are safe and informed and educated to make their own choices, right? Rather than regulating people's choices for them. Now that, but that also goes into moral and philosophical questions. And I'm curious, I'm open to hear what other people have to say about that. But, when we're thinking about just data and thinking about the trends and why certain things happen, right? Trends in abortions. There's also, it's important for us to consider who has abortions, right? And so um, that is oftentimes shaped by how we treat women in our society. So if a woman doesn't have access to resources, or her opportunities are significantly hindered by having a child at an early age, 20 to 24, or 20, really 20 to 29, that's the majority. In their 20s, if you get pregnant, your opportunities in life are significantly changed, right? Yet at older ages, obviously, um, there are plenty of women in their 30s who are getting pregnant, but they may be more established, they may have education, they have, maybe partnered, and those kinds of things to have the support to be successful in that pregnancy. But I think we have to then also question, what is it about our society that puts a woman at a disadvantage if they have a child at a certain age? Because theoretically, 20 to 29 is actually the best time for a woman to have a child biologically, right? But physically, biologically, it's the best time for them, but socially, it is the worst time for them. Partially because when you have a child, there are very few resources to support a single mother in the United States. But what I have learned, what I think is very interesting, is that in other countries like Germany, my sister lives in Germany, and um, they actually have 1 in 5 German families are under single parent households. That's 1.6 million parents with 2.3 million kids. The vast majority are single mothers. Um, and yet, the single parent household, um, they don't fare as badly as, of course, they have some issues. What is relief for single parents? Here we go. So my sister lives in Germany, and she was explaining that single mothers get a monthly stipend from the government to support them and their children. Um, they they also, I think, get, so the relief, they get 1,900 euro annually, um, that goes towards supporting them. The education for children in Germany is all the way through college is free, right? They have free childcare, they have free health care. And so, this idea that being a single mother, being a single parent may not be as bad in societies that support single women, single mothers, and single women. So I'm just curious to see what it versus United States. I want to see if um, there's any difference. I don't know if there's any kind of analysis. Let me see. Let's see, abortion rates. Here we go. Okay, so the United States abortion rate is 20.8%. Or no, that's the rate. So it's 20.8 per 100,000, I think. We want to see what the actual numbers, United States. Okay. And then y'all gonna have to help me find where Germany is. That's France, Switzerland, Germany. Abortion rate 7.8. So it's much lower. So in countries that have less support for single mothers, the rates seem a lot higher. 53%, my God. Um, and then in countries that maybe have a little bit more support from others, um, maybe it's possible. That's a theory. I cannot confirm or deny that theory right now, but that is a theory, I think. And then you have to go and look at the data to see, does this confirm or deny? You also want to look at not only the rates, but also the policies for single mothers that help support. Do they have paid parental leave? Do they have free health care and free child care? Do they provide stipends to single mothers and those kinds of things to see if that affects the abortion rate? Right. And so, um, okay. Okay. I think I talked about a lot of these things in here. So this kind of dives into how symbolic interactionism, conflict theory, and functionalism, um, how those perspectives, theoretical perspectives, help you better understand and or critique um, theories around gender and sexuality. So I would dive into those things for you later. And then I think we kind of covered both of them at the same time, but I did want to bring up this idea, this other conversation that I've seen some of the students talk about on Twitter about, the United States. Yes, we have the most diverse country in the world. We have 14% of Americans are foreign born. We have 150 ethnic groups. Um, and the proportion of the white population is declining. As you see this decline over time, we are starting to see a rise in racial violence. And part of that is there's this narrative that's happening on the dark interwebs, on a lot of these blogs, about, there's a direct tie between this anti-immigration sentiment and the rise in racial violence in the United States. There's a narrative that immigrants are coming to take over our jobs, take over our homes, take over our families, um, by interracial marriage, and they are taking our American identity. Yet there's this other narrative that the United States, the essence of American identity is immigration and diversity. And so it's an interesting kind of dichotomy between the two, that, this idea that the proportion of the white population is declining is directly or is correlated with, using some of your sociology terms, correlated with anti-immigrant sentiment and a rise in racial violence. You know, here's something that this slide is important because I think that we assume that the United States has always been majority white, and that we it like the United States naturally is majority white. But we also know Thanksgiving is coming up, and the narrative of, you know, the European and American Indian populations getting along and sitting down at dinner, and Pocahontas falling in love with John Smith, and those are all myths. Pocahontas was 14 years old and she was kidnapped by John Smith and then taken to Europe, right? So she was human trafficked um, and put on display, much like Venus Hottentot and other African women who were enslaved and put on display. They were dressed up in clothes or stripped down naked and, pranced around the world. So, paraded around the world. So, the United States was originally American Indian. Or was they didn't call themselves American Indian, but that's what we call them now. So it was originally American Indian country, right? I'm gonna send you all a link to some Zoom panel discussions that I think have been interesting, talking about this social construction of like American Indian identity and the purposeful exclusion of Black people from American Indian identity. Um, which I'm going to dive into a little bit later, but I want to go into this graph because the laws around immigration have changed over time, which also has impacted our ethnic composition. So there was a law, again, Radical 60s, was a law that was passed in 1965 that opened up the borders and allowed people from African countries, Caribbean countries, Latin American countries, and Asian American countries, Middle Eastern countries to come to the United States. And they opened up immigration. Prior to 1965, there was a quota system that specifically limited the number of people who could come from non-European countries. But they said, come one, come all from Europe, right? So there was immigration from Ireland and England and from Eastern European countries to the United States prior to 1965. There were no quotas on them. They could come as many people as they wanted. And so there was this artificial inflation of white European groups in the United States. And then there was a lot of kind of civil rights activism and pushing for the US government to open the borders and eliminate quotas to allow for additional groups the opportunity to come into this country. Now, if you fast forward, right, to 2020, you now see that there's, this kind of idea that the United States is this open country. We want immigrants, it's an immigration country. We celebrate diversity. That is only within the context of a small number of diverse groups in the United States. As that group grows, you start to see more anti-immigrant and anti-Black in particular sentiment. So, there's a lot of antagonism there, but at the same time, there's a lot of push for more celebration of diversity as well, right? So, you know, if anything, we've also, at the same time we've seen this racial violence, we've also seen all this Black Lives Matter movement. We've also seen all of this, you know, fighting for the rights of immigrants to stay here and to be here as full residents and full citizens in the United States. These laws around who is legal or not legal were also created in the 1960s as a way, as a reaction to um, making it more difficult for people. Even so, they eliminated the quotas, right? But then they added in these other laws that made it more difficult for people to immigrate here and to stay here legally, quote unquote, right? And so all those people who came from Europe prior to 1965 did not have to go through the same process of naturalization that our current immigrants do. So this idea that someone is legal or they're breaking the law is really arbitrary. And so you also have to think about, when we talk about laws, laws do not always mean they're just. It just means that it's law, right? So I thought this was interesting. I did not like the definition. um, Racial groups. It says they share visible physical characteristics that members of a society consider socially important. That's kind of traditionally how we think about racial groups, but I would challenge that. And here's why. See if I can go to my Instagram. I don't know if this is going to help you. My family, okay, here we go. My family is from Louisiana. Um, and so when we think about traditional kind of racial groups, they share physical characteristics. We categorize African American as dark skin, kinky hair, wide nose, from Africa, right? Like that's the definitions that have been created for that racial group. Um, and then there's, you know, the race Asian has become a racial group in the United States. Native American has become a racial group and white has become a racial group. But each one of those groups were also socially and legally constructed. Um, I think my family is a good example of this. This is an Instagram page for many of the people that I'm related to in Louisiana. I don't know all these people. I know some of them. Um, and and you can see quite a diversity of skin color, eye color, um, you know, all, and we're all related. We're It's a mixture of African, European, and American Indian. So what would we categorize these people as? Would we categorize them as black, as American Indian, as European? They have all of that blood in them, and yet the social construction and the legal construction in the United States is that we have categorized them as black because of the one drop rule. If you go to Latin American countries, um, these same people would not be categorized as black because of their skin color. They would be categorized as some other. They, like in Brazil, they have something like 100 different racial categories based on skin color, and you could have different racial categories of family members, of siblings, could be different racial categories based on their skin color. If you go to yeah, so you know that kind of construction of our racial categories differs depending on where you come from. I want to show you also um, You can't see it from here. So we categorize North African people, like those from Morocco, as in the United States, we categorize them as white, even though they have dark skin and kinky hair and they come from Africa. But they also have this kind of Arab mixture, right? So my brother-in-law, or for my sister's ex-husband, is Moroccan. You can see there's quite a diversity. Also, they look like my family in Louisiana, right? Quite a diversity of people from Morocco. He actually just did a genetic test. These are also people from Morocco. They are dark skinned. They look sub-Saharan African, right? Um, that he did a genetic test with 23andMe, and I thought it was fascinating because um, it was like maybe 85% of his DNA came from Nigeria, but he was born in Morocco, right? And when he came to the United States, he was categorized as white because he was born in Morocco, even though he was brown skinned. So, these kind of constructions of race are arbitrary and social and, socially constructed. And so when this racial group just definition doesn't necessarily um, really encompass it all because it's not just about physical characteristics and it's not just about ancestry. It's also about who we categorize based on what is legally convenient for us, right, in the United States. Again, let me give you an example of the Creole. Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case. He was a Creole person in Louisiana who got on a train in the white section. He sat in the white section of the train when we had segregation, and the attendant told him he needed to get up and move to the colored section. He sued and said that he deserved to be there because he was majority white. He basically looked white. He lived a white life. He was light skinned person. But that Supreme Court case actually said that it ruled against him, and he lost because he had one drop of black, quote unquote, one drop of black blood. He had a black ancestor, and so then it made anybody who had any black ancestry in the United States become black, even if they look like this person, right? And so that again, that goes back to the social construction of race versus what actually is. There is no actual racial difference. I thought it was interesting too. I have a friend of mine who is in the sociology PhD program with me, and her family is like Scotch Irish. She has, red hair, freckles, all this stuff. And we were in the car one night and we were having a conversation about race, and she said, well, because I think we were talking about even my family. I bring that up a lot. I talk about my family all the time. And so we were talking about my family and genetics and that kind of thing. And she said, she made the comment that she didn't know what her genetic history was. Oftentimes, this is true of many white people that um, to become white in the United States, they oftentimes had to give up their ethnic distinctiveness, right? Their language. They changed their names to become more British sounding. And so the Irish were often also dark skinned people. And then they purposefully kind of took away de-irishized themselves. They were considered black in the United States for a while because they were dark and they were low income and they were new immigrants. They had strong accents. They spoke a different language. They were Catholic, right? Um, and they went through a process of separating themselves from the ghetto, and from their ethnic identity to become white. They moved out of those ghetto neighborhoods in New York and in East Coast. They moved to the suburbs. They got jobs as police officers and teachers, and they bought homes, right, and became white. And so socially and legally, they transferred from a subgroup of ethnicity to almost losing their ethnicity, right? Their ethnic identity is totally stripped. So she made the comment, "Oh, I'm just white. I don't know. I think I'm Irish and I think I'm Scotch because I have freckles, right?" And she said also that she made the comment that her genetic history was so far away from African DNA, that she made some comment like that, like, "Oh, we're just so far apart." And I was like, actually, European white Europeans are the closest genetic cousins to African than any other group, and Asian are the furthest away, because they were the first to migrate out of Africa. So, just again, these ideas of race are oftentimes arbitrary and socially constructed. Okay. I think I went into some of this stuff already. This idea that someone is undocumented, it increased from the 80s, but it also increased because the laws changed. um, so it doesn't necessarily mean that more people came. Well, it's a combination of more people coming to the United States because they opened the borders, but they also changed the laws to make people illegal. Um, okay. We talk about anti-immigrant sentiment. We've already talked about that. In minority groups in the United States, that's also a socially constructed concept. If you think about what minority really means, in the literal sense, Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans actually make up the majority of the world, and European people are the minority. And so the minority, even though we're seen as the majority in the United States, they're actually the minority of the world. Um, so the irony is that the minority of the world operates within a category of the majority because of their status and their access to resources. That is not to say that all white people experience, are wealthy, or that kind of thing. And I think that the book goes into this, but you experience other privileges, right? Because you have kind of, the world is created with you in mind. It's created with kind of a British idea of, like, everybody's names changed to fit within the construct of British language. Most people in the world speak English. Um, I gave the example of Band-Aids being colored with kind of like a white European skin color. Um, that there's so many examples. If a traffic cop pulls me over, are you afraid that that traffic cop would single you out because of your race, and or potentially escalate the situation because they assume you are guilty before even interacting with you, right? So those are privileges that not don't necessarily always translate into wealth. But if you also look at the wealth, we talked about this before. If you look at the wealth gap, between, the wealth gap is growing anyway, just overall. But then if you look at the wealth gap between racial groups in the United States, it is, um, a stark difference between white, black, Latinx, and Asian, with white being the most wealthy. Um, You got all of this. I think this one is interesting. I don't know if I totally agree with these categories, but um, a lot of times we think about racism as people who hate other people or who people who think they're superior to others. But when you think about all of those examples that I gave about immigration, about privilege, and about the construction of race and racial categories, who fits into certain categories versus not, and the kind of historical examples of creating inequality and manufacturing inequality. Um, it's that is kind of the systematic and institutional example of what racism can be. Institutional racism, right? It builds up over time. It may be enacted by individual racist people, but it's too simple to say that racism is just about people who hate people, because you can also be discriminatory, right, without necessarily being prejudiced. I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who is the CEO of a big research company, a white woman, and we have started to become friends. And she, during all of this kind of racial unrest, she started to reflect on herself and her company and how she ran her company. She does not see herself as racist, and actually, she advocated for another organization to put out a statement about Black Lives Matter. And then she realized through all of that work that she also needed to take a look at herself and her company, because her board of directors was all white men and all of her senior leadership is all white men and women. And so while she would not be, I wouldn't categorize her as prejudiced, she does still practice discrimination. And so that's when we talk about implicit bias and this like idea that we don't even realize until we are consciously thinking about it, how we are replicating inequality and replicating racism and replicating sexism and replicating heterosexism, right? So, yeah, we talked about the declining majority. We talked about these things. Um, so this is, I'm skipping a little bit, but this one is interesting too because, and it's in the Facebook Live that I'm going to send you a link to. They talk about federally recognized versus state recognized tribes. Oftentimes, the federal government, in order to become federally recognized, the federal government forced American Indian communities to reject its Black members. So, a lot of times, American Indians would live in maroon societies with escaped African people who escaped slavery, or they would intermarry. Like I explained, I showed you examples of how my family has intermixture between American Indian, Choctaw, African, and French, right? A lot of times they live in the same quarters, they worked on the same plantations. American Indians were oftentimes free but indentured, whereas African people were enslaved. And so there was a lot of intermingling. Um, so they had children, obviously, but the federal government, this is again going back to this kind of social construction of race and arbitrary distinctions of who gets to be classified as what. So the federal government told them, in order for you to be recognized as a federal tribe and for us to give you funding and land, you have to reject your Black members. You have to have a written language, and you have to have um, like a written history. And so that automatically excluded many American Indian tribes who had Black members, or like, what is this thing about having a written language? Most there's a lot of cultures and communities that do not have written languages. So that's also this arbitrary rule that's based on European standards that then limits the number of people who actually get federal recognition and then therefore federal dollars. And so there's a lot. The North Carolina has the highest concentration of um, state and federally recognized tribes east of the Mississippi. Um, but there's also kind of this antagonism and this arbitrary distinction between federal and state, and those who are not recognized at all, based on these rules that were dictated um, by the federal government. And also, when we talk about again, why are American Indian populations um, economically not doing well? A big part of it is that even when they were granted land, universities, including Wake Forest University, um, would land grant institutions. Um, many of them would get land. They would take land from um, American Indian communities. So this is Wikipedia. It's not always a credible source. I would encourage you to look up a better source and do not cite Wikipedia on any of my stuff. But this is just for quick information purposes. Um, land grant universities became large public universities that offer educational opportunities in some private schools. However, they were oftentimes the land was taken from American Indian communities, oftentimes at very low money, or they were kind of acquired without any payment and then given to universities to establish. So, when we talk about taking resources and kind of this arbitrary inflation of wealth, this arbitrary inflation of dominance um, and the majority in this country, we're really talking about a fear that the things that were done in the United States to subjugate other groups is going to happen to them, right? I would encourage you all to also look at the New York Times um, 1619. They have a podcast, so if you can listen to that if you want. But there's a whole project that talks about all of these things, these legal and economic and social mechanisms to this is annoying, mechanisms to arbitrarily create inequality in the United States. So we have an ugly history that we are reckoning with right now. Um, and, so that could, a lot of these examples kind of fall under multiple, theoretical lenses, right? The functionalist lens is that, yes, we have inequality, but immigration provides workers and a cultural and assimilation, increased social solidarity. However, um, you know, and so like the United States, that's the functionalist perspective, is that we are a melting pot and that we're diverse and that we all live together, and it creates a society that is functional for us. However, the conflict approach is, thinking about how those laws were created and enacted as a way to maintain inequality and to benefit a dominant group. And that has then created conflict, um, and to maintain advantages primarily through economic exploitation. So those examples that I've given you a lot of times fall in line with conflict theory. I am admittedly more of a conflict theorist than a functionalist. Um, and then, feminist theory kind of ties into that there's other additional layers for women that also tie into kind of this racial ethnic creation. Also, here's another kind of interesting legal kind of approach was that they, and this ties to immigration today as well as to slavery, that a woman who gives birth to a child, um, the if it is a black woman, they um, the slave owner owned both the woman and the children. Um, and if the woman was free, that did not necessarily mean that the children were free. So now you think about it in terms of immigration, a woman who is an immigrant, oftentimes undocumented, who gives birth to a child in the United States, that child is born on American land, is automatically a US citizen, but the mother is not. So, there's kind of that feminist slash conflict theory around maintaining inequality by separating children from their mothers and saying that one person in the family is valued as an American citizen and has rights and the other does not. It's arbitrary. That law could be changed today. So, just thinking about that. Um, and then all of those things kind of feed into interactions between each other, this interpersonal interactions, whether someone's discriminatory or prejudiced, whether they've internalized those beliefs about themselves and other groups, right? Having antagonistic attitudes toward minorities or other groups, right? So that about wraps it up. I'm losing my voice. Then we talked about this too. Another example of my family miscegenation. Sometimes, a lot of times, people think of racial mixture as an indication that we are progressing in our in racial equality. But but we have to remember that interracial marriage was not legal until like 1972 with Loving versus Virginia. So that's a relatively new thing, but miscegenation has been happening for centuries in the United States. We've had mixture. My family has been mixed since 1770s, right? Between Black, American Indian, and European. So miscegenation, this racial mixture, does not necessarily mean progression in diversity, right? So we have to think about a larger context around our attitudes toward different groups and how that ties into economic opportunity, political opportunity, social opportunity. Those are the things that also are indicators of our progression towards diversity and celebration of that, and really achieving the ideals that we like to think of as the United States as a melting pot. So, okay. I hope this helps. I hope this gives you information and perspective. Feel free to challenge me on these things. I love the dialogue. And I hope I will try to finish grading the midterms soon.